All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another Lean In event. Enough about the why. Let's talk about the how, part two. So, some of you I did see in part one. So, thank you for joining again. I'm really excited to continue the conversation with you here. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Amrita Agarwal. My pronouns are she and her, and I've been working with Lean In Canada as their events team lead for about 2 years now. I think in November, it'll be 2 years. So it's pretty exciting to see this long journey that I've had with them. In my full-time role, I work as a workshop facilitator. And of course, if you're not currently a member of Lean In Canada at the moment, please feel free to join in from our website. It's that big red button on our website, and it's free, and you'll get to know first when our next amazing events are happening. All right, so I'm so stoked to introduce our panel today. Before I do, I'd love to talk about what we discussed in the last session. So we talked about the biggest challenges and obstacles that company had faced with DEI today. We talked about IDEA, which was shared by our panelist, Sherry. We also talked about flipping the question. We also talked about perspective taking and about hiring quota. So we had a lot of discussions, and we're taking the discussion today with our esteemed panelist, Kathy Gibson, who is the president and CEO of Catchy Consulting Inc. Prior to establishing the company over a decade ago, she held the role of Director of Human Resources, achieving Best Employer Awards twice. Kathy has acted as a senior project manager, consultant, and advisor on a number of influential projects, including multiple provincial sector labor market partnership projects in collaboration with the Vancouver Economic Commission and virtually every tech industry association across the province. We're so glad you could join us, Kathy.
Oh, let's unmute the I'm today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to join and to share in the dialogue. It's really important dialogue, and I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, and certainly very keen to see where it all goes tonight. So thank you so much. Again, my pronouns are she, her, and I am joining from the unceded territory of the Squamish and Musqueam nations here in Vancouver, British Columbia, and just again very grateful and humbled to be on my own learning journey as well, and to be here to share with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that. All right, and next on our panel, we have Rachel Irvine-Halliday, who is a Jedi, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion warrior, whose focus is on building and leading the DEI strategy for large tech-based organizations. An experienced servant leader with 25 years of building high-performing inclusive teams with a key focus on impacting the DEI strategy, and she on employee experience and organizational culture. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you, Amrita. I'm really excited to be here and partnering with everybody to have this conversation. Thank you.
All right, so without further ado, let's begin with the questions. So my first question to the panel is, so we've talked about, of course, about DEI practices, about having them, but what we haven't been able to talk about is how can companies ensure that their DEI policies are sustainable? And Kathy, would you like to start us off with this question? Oh, you're on mute, Kathy.
Let's take care of that. Sorry about that. No, I appreciate that, and yeah, no, I think the sustainability factor is such an enormous component, because ultimately, a lot of organizations that I talk with, they're like, okay, we're going to do this DEI thing. This is a priority for our staff. We're getting a lot of activism happening. We know we're supposed to do something. We're not sure what. And so, when you're diving into the work, and if you don't take a lens into the future and what the sustainability looks like, there's multiple risks involved. And so ultimately, I think that if you're focused on the employees within your organization and really looking at the unique needs of those individuals, and considering, the intersectionality of individuals, underrepresented populations, and really understanding the challenges that are faced at the employee level, then it will help you it will be like informative in terms of building out strategies to combat and combat those challenges that might come up and might arise. So I think that the other really important key thing is around transparency. So I think one of the easy fails is when we're building out these policies and initiatives within our respective organizations. We're like, okay, we're doing the work, and we have good intent. We need to be really transparent in our messaging around what the company's DE&I goals actually are. So, and it can be as simple as, we're hoping to improve. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm like going to, and I've seen enormous success, and I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from going in and saying, I'm going to double, the female representation on our software development team, or whatever that might look like, or on our board, or we're going to really look at the number of people of color or Indigenous people that are within our organization, or people with disabilities, and starting to actually really understand and uncover what the organizational makeup actually looks like. And so part of that is also benchmarking for diversity and understanding the data, because you need to be able to understand, your people in terms of your employee base, but also where you're starting from and where you want to go. So I think those are some, fairly crucial components around sustainability. And then I would just say that, and we all know this, but starting at the top down and really making sure that, for employees to be enticed by the initiatives, they want to know that their leaders are committed and are.
I'm sorry, Kathy, you broke off on the last sentence.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say that, and I apologize, I had connectivity issues today, but I am fully wired in. So I was just going to say that I think that, I hear a lot of the time that there's a lot of good intention on leaders' parts, and it's like, how do you go about ensuring that that's being communicated out, that there's learning happening with our executives around microaggressions and these slights that happen in the workspace where, my intention wasn't that. I'm so sorry that that's how I showed up, and really listening and taking a moment and apologizing where necessary so that the conversation can continue and that the efforts are sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that. And I loved your idea about seeing where you are and where you want to go. And I think that's important in every initiative that we take up. Mm-hmm. So Rachel, did you have anything to add to that?
Regular touch points and communications out. To Kathy's point, from the leadership perspective, is the transparency, sharing what's going on and what's happening. That I reinforce that with leaders. If you think you're communicating enough, triple it. Like, just make sure that you're consistently messaging out what's going on, what's happening, what goals you have, how you're achieving them. And also be authentic about it, and be honest about where you may not have achieved what you set out to do, and why, and what you've learned from it. I think that helps immensely in an organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel, for adding that, and loved what Tina also said in the comments, that you need to keep the motivation going as well. You need to ask, why are we doing this, and answer that question all the time. Thank you so much. Okay, so my next question is, how can companies align the employee resource groups with the senior leadership? And Rachel, you worked with ERGs a lot. Could you share your experience? How did that go for you?
Sure. So I was with Electronic Arts for 20 years up until about a month ago, and was part of the core team that started our ERGs at EA about 8 years ago. And it's I could go on for hours about this because I'm particularly passionate about the power of ERGs. I think they're the gift to an organization if you're willing to use them in the right way and nurture them in the right way. But I think the number one thing about ERGs is, first and foremost, they have to have executive sponsorship. That's absolutely massively important, because otherwise there's not the gravitas behind them. They're not seen as important to the business. And the number one thing, number one, they're both sort of aligned here: leadership, sponsorship, but the ERG goals have to be aligned with your company strategy. So how is the ERG going to be in service of achieving your business goals as well? Because that again gives it that ability to help impact. And so this is moving from intention to impact. But ERGs are such a wealth of information for your leaders, for your managers, for people coming into your organization. I found that in the last year and a half with onboarding, people coming into the organization having an automatic touchstone with an ERG, not just even one, but multiple, based on intersectionality, interest, wanting to be an active ally. They're such an amazing gift, and they're a safe space for identities, and then also for allies to be there to help educate themselves and give back to those communities.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. And yeah, I see Tina has also given a shout out to you about your impact at EA and all the work that you've done there. And I appreciate what you said about, ERGs are also an opportunity for allies to learn about how they can show up, how they can help out as well. And also this creation of psychological safety. So that kind of brings me into another question that I wanted to ask. How should organizational leadership support psychological safety of the workforce? So psychological safety, for those who are not aware, is when people have the open space without being judged, where they can say what they want, they can talk to other people without being judged or criticized or discriminated against. So Kathy, what do you think? How can organizational leadership do that? How can we create these psychological spaces?
Wonderful question. I think, there's so many variables involved. I mean, trust, ultimately, like creating an environment where there's safety in making mistakes and taking risks, I think is one variable, for example. But really, for an employee to feel like they can show up at work as their whole self is there's a lot of talk right now about this, and it's like, oh, of course, we want people to show up and be who they are, but in practice, that means that people communicate differently. It means that you're creating space. It means that you're listening. It means that things might take longer, to, in terms of the process that's embedded within the organization, in the way that we, the way that the practice might have been done to date. So I think it's really about creating safety and security and a sense of belonging and inclusion. So there's so many elements to this. And I think that, I've seen organizations that do it really, really well, where they give employees space and room to really show up and be their whole selves. And what that, and that, I that terminology, I think, is getting kind of thrown around, but I mean, it's one of those things where if you can go in and just be who you are and actually offer your thoughts, and whether you're building a product or building a marketing strategy or whatever you're doing in terms of your work, we all bring with us to our workplace our whole selves. And so feeling as though we can show up in the safety of that and be accepted, and that there's room for that piece of our lives, because you don't want to live a compartmentalized life where we're like, okay, I'm going into work and I'm doing my work, and I want to be able to talk about what's happening in my life and what that might mean, and that might mean something different to someone with a disability or someone who is queer, or someone that, you know, has an enormous family, and you know, so many variables, or is a single parent, or like all these things. So I think that there's a huge opportunity to sort of really lean into listening and creating space and elevating voices that maybe aren't always heard, um, from a psychological safety perspective. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that. And definitely being able to bring your whole self to work is definitely worthwhile. And we all want to work in organizations like that. But, you know, a lot of times, and I've read articles on this as well, bringing your whole self to work, and sometimes, you know, just being part of that conversation, having to always advocate for yourself can cause burnout. So exactly, it takes courage to bring your whole authentic self, as Rachel has pointed out. So Rachel, what do you think, how can we prevent burnout within these employees, whether they're working for ERGs or just trying to advocate on their own? What can we do for them?
It's not incumbent on those specific identities to educate the rest of us. So I think reminding leaders and team members and managers that the person of color, the queer person, the disabled person, the Jewish person, the Muslim person, it's not incumbent on them to educate the rest of us. I don't know how many times I say that in a week of, we have Google. We have Instagram. You can go and follow people that are outside of your bubble to learn more. But I think for the burnout perspective, from an ERG perspective, I think rotation. You can't have people stay in those sort of leadership positions on ERGs for more than a year or two. We know we had to do a lot of coaching and counseling, because it's heavy work. We know anybody who works in the DEI or space, there's a backpack of emotions and psychic emotional baggage that goes with it. So we need to make space for that. I also think rewarding this. So the rewarding the behavior, recognizing and rewarding the behaviors that we want to see, goes a long way to acknowledging, hey, you've been participating outside of your regular job to help move the organization forward to becoming an inclusive, belonging culture. We're going to recognize that. Whether and in what way, shape, or form, it's entirely up to, you know, the organization, whether it's monetary, whether it's verbal, whether it's an all hands, time off, whatever it is. I think that goes a long way. But burnout, that's a big one to undo right now. I think making sure people remember that self-care is absolutely tantamount for themselves. And if they need to raise the hand and say, you know what, I need to step back for a little bit because I'm feeling my glass is half empty, then we as leaders in organizations need to say, yes, thank you. And whenever you're ready, if you want to come back into the space, we welcome you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Rachel. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Kathy. Mm-hmm.
I've like wholeheartedly loved everything you said, Rachel. And I think it's almost, that recognition piece is so interesting too, because it's almost like love languages. Like what do people need to know to be acknowledged? You know,
Mhm.
is it that they're being recognized monetarily and that's important to them, or is it that they're receiving gratitude and words of affirmation? And it's like, there's ways that we can give that love back to our people, and ways that really hit people to their core, and ways that are like, oh, that was nice. And kind of understanding that about our human our human capital and our people is actually really, really important. And as leaders, we have that opportunity to lean in and to actually figure out what some of the motivations and the intentions, and what's meaningful in terms of recognizing those behaviors to them.
Yeah, totally agree. I like the love languages, that idea of it. It is. I've always said that there needs to be more love in the workplace. because we spend enough time together, and I see my team as my extended family. I love them to bits. They're awesome. I want to know what's making them tick and what's keeping them up at night, especially in the world that we live in today, because we want people to come to, if you're going to bring your authentic self to work and be resourceful and creative and innovative. I know if there's a backpack, thanks, Sherry. But I want to be able to help understand the burdens that I might not see or that might not be visible as a leader. And that's super important.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing, and to Sherry as well. And I love that perspective that you've shared on, understanding the love language of your employees, and that goes out with empathy as well. Knowing what they want, knowing the kind of appreciation or support that they would need to be able to show up, and that also is about psychological safety. And I believe that these words could be a little big for companies that are just starting out, right? Like they don't understand what's going on. They probably don't even know. And there are companies out in the world who are not even aware of DEI. So to those companies who just started, they've sat down, they've realized that, this is a problem. Kathy, what would you suggest to them? What would you recommend? What should they do?
Oh, great question. Okay, well, I think that there's a lot of things that organizations can do, and they don't necessarily. I think there's this you know myth out there that you need to have huge budget, you need to have massive capacity. You might get it wrong, so don't do anything. Like I think there's all these like all these unfortunate mistruths out there but ultimately I think that the very first thing I always sort of recommend is understanding where people are at and starting with maybe some focus groups and knowing, kind of get a bit of a lay of the land of what are some of the outstanding issues, looking into the issues around your exit interviews, trying to dive in and get a bit of a gauge and talking to your people, but then also actual collection. About this later session, but really understanding where you're
sorry, Kathy, you cut off in the last sentence. Sorry.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say that understanding where you are now will really inform how far you need to go and what needs to happen. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I understand that. And I think we're going to talk more about that. But also, I think that there's lots of kind of low-hanging fruit that leaders can grasp and be like, okay, I'm present, I'm listening. Let's do some things. I love ERGs. I think that there's just so much that can be done in terms of that work and that space. Certainly, doing some foundational training with all staff is my recommendation, and certainly C-suite. And I do a lot of board and C-suite specific training and coaching, but I think that there's also this wonderful opportunity around sort of foundational. We're all going to have a basic level of understanding of what this looks like. It can be a really wonderful place to start, and diving into unconscious bias and some preconceived notions that we have, and understanding our privilege and all and not, and so really understanding and leaning into the intersectionality and knowing that there's room to make mistakes, and we misspeak and we say things that we're like, oh my god, what did I just say? And knowing that there's space to actually say, you know what, can I reframe that, or I'm not sure I heard from that person in the room, can we just circle back? And I think that was a really good idea, and I want to help lift that. So I think, again, we talked a little bit about this, but communicating initiatives to the greater organization and building excitement. And when you're looking at sort of the creation of different initiatives can be fantastic and can be amplified throughout the organization. I really loved what Rachel said about tripling whatever you think you're doing around communication, because it's such a common theme across the board. It's but also and communicating out the changes of the data and the areas of success. So it's hey, we're on a learning journey. This isn't going to happen overnight, and knowing that we're making incremental improvements in understanding and improving empathy and improving what this journey looks like altogether. And I'll do a very brief, quick plug, and I'm sure no one will mind. But um, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Resource Hub that I PM, we have a bit of a maturity model, actually, a little quiz that just on like, hey, where are you? It's very basic, but it helps sort of identify where you are in terms of the journey itself, so that you might start accessing different resources to help push along different mechanisms to make change quite quickly. So, I really like communication training. I love ERGs when you get there, and benchmarking, I think, are key ones in my mind that are good starting places.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I would actually love that link because I know my organization could use it. So if you can send it in the chat, I think that Tina has already done that. Thank you, Tina. Thank you. Love that. But yeah, definitely. And I've heard so many great things about Kathy. So if your organization does want to reach out, Kathy is the best person here to do so with. Okay. So as we're talking about starting out, a lot of issues are going to come up. And one could be, what is the best approach to implement DEI strategies? So Rachel, what do you think? What kind of an approach would be ideal? Should they follow a top-down, bottom-up, or like a middle-out approach? What would be the right way to start?
I am living this right now in my new role. So I'm leading up in inclusion, diversity, and equity for Amazon Games. I'm in my 8th day in the new role. But obviously Amazon is a giant company, and they have, I've learned today, almost 400 DEI practitioners across the company, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. My organization is an organization of 700 people. And while they are connected to the broader organization, they don't have their own DEI strategy yet. So we're starting that right now, and it's a top-down. I spent today coaching my new leader on communication and messaging, and he, in a coaching perspective, it was, a lot of leaders don't want to be in front of these messages because there's fear of judgment and speaking from my experience, a lot of our leaders in tech are white men, so they feel a little under the microscope. But my coaching around that to any leader is, you're a leader, you model the behaviors that you're asking of your organization. And if you're going to empower and enable your organization to be more inclusive and thrive and be a belonging culture, you need to be out front of this. That said, your ERGs also help move this forward. So while it's top down, I do believe as time goes on, it becomes across the organization. But I really do think that leaders have to get out in front of it. Communicate, solicit feedback. Kathy talked about focus groups. I think there's such a gift of getting people together and asking what's going on for you at this moment in time, and then thinking about how that ties to building out the strategy. And I would say you start small. You don't go for, we're going to achieve 15 things in our first year of our strategy. What's going to move the needle towards the goals that you've identified based on the data that your organization has given you?
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. And I loved your perspective on starting small and not just tackling on 15 things at the same time. And so that brings me oh, go ahead, Kathy, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to plug, I just want to say, so Rachel, has donated under Electronic Arts resources to the hub, and Amazon also was involved in the launch of the resource hub. And it's wonderful to have these sort of tech innovation based organizations that are involved in this conversation, and they often know there's so much work to do in this space, and they recognize and acknowledge that often our numbers are not as favorable as many other sectors of the economy. And so I just want to acknowledge, because I think that the work that you've done, Rachel, at electronic arts has been like fantastic, and you sharing that out in the course of my baby project with across the province, but like, you know, with all the trainings and showing up, and I just really I'm grateful. So yeah, I think that's.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that. Okay. So yeah, my next question is, so Kathy, you've worked with data a lot, and of course, we've just been touching upon that. So what kind of barriers can companies expect to face while collecting this data? We just talked about focus group as well, right? And how can they address this issue? How can companies overcome these barriers?
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So I think the very first one that often comes up is really like, why are you asking me these questions? Right. So when you go out to your employee base and you're asking for data around representation, there's often a lot of hesitation. There's sometimes hesitation around the security mechanisms that data is being held in, which are very, you know, those are important questions around who's storing the data and why and how and what does that look like. But once you sort those pieces out from a confidentiality and from a security perspective and are able to be really confident in your answers around that, I think that there's really an element of building trust to encourage disclosure. So, and what we've seen is that year over year, disclosure will increase over time. And so I have a governance committee around the diversity, equity, and inclusion projects that I work on, and I had a senior C-suite leader from the First Nations Technology Council who she would share broadly that, you know, she was like, you know, the first year I was asked for my representation data, she's like, I didn't provide it. Like, I'm an Indigenous woman, and why am I answering this? Like, so I think that you really have to create a layer of trust around what your intent is around the data is a really important piece in the process. So it's like we want to improve the situation. We want to understand where we are. We, you know, like having that dialogue with staff. Am I okay?
You said, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So and then the other piece, was I cutting out? Am I okay? Sorry,
Yeah,
I've had
no,
a
you're
funny
okay.
connection.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, and I would say by providing resources and education around the purpose of the collection of the data, allows employees to kind of, you know, relax their nervous systems, and they can kind of feel a little bit more like, okay, we know that this is confidential, and there's a purpose around why, and we're getting a land, you know, we're doing we're getting a lay of the land around where the organization is at. And one thing I'll throw this into the chat as well, but the hub, the DEI hub, has a really phenomenal toolkit around resources, including everything from like a video for staff, just on like, this is why we're collecting it, all the way through to the actual questions. Definitely open to, you know, further iterations of different and more expansive questioning and things like that. But this is like, you know, done some legal rounds and had lots of consult within the sector, and is something that can be leveraged and is free. So I'll throw that up in the chat in case it's of interest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for sharing additional resources as well. And I loved what you said about, you know, creating that space so that people are willing to talk to you. And I think that is one of the hardest part in working in this space. I agree. Okay, so my next question is going to be for Rachel. And so the question is, you know, like, when we're hiring, do you have any recommendations, you know, like how can companies promote DEI, you know, during the hiring process and make sure that we can retain the talent? Do you have any experience with that?
A little. One of the things I've been responsible for over the years is making sure that the full employee journey, that we have key touch points around inclusion, diversity, equity, And so we built it into our onboarding process. I think being very clear upfront with new employees about what good looks like, what behaviors we want to see, that we expect to see around inclusive, behaviors, curiosity, empathy, those kinds of things, is really important for setting the tone. So there's nobody can say, well, I didn't know that this wasn't acceptable behavior. I also think throughout their employee journey with the company of what are we doing for individual contributors, because those are the people that will grow into maybe some of our managers. So making sure that we're developing them. It's not a one size fits all though. That's the thing. So it's meeting our populations where they're at. But the one thing I will say is that managers hold a lot of the key to unlocking inclusive behaviors at organizations. Leaders make the statements and build the strategies, but managers are the ones that are on the ground executing and trying to build these cultures of inclusion and belonging. So I think once we get managers into an organization, giving them the tools and empowering them to be able to create safe, psychologically safe spaces, build trust, have challenging conversations, be okay with what they don't know, is really, really important. But having key touchstones across the employee experience and journey as they novate from individual contributor to manager to senior leader, I think is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. Kathy, did you have something to add to that?
I think Rachel is fairly comprehensive there, but I think that when it comes to retention, I think when we look at our budgets around how we're spending professional development dollars, I think we have to look at where those dollars are going. And I think that can also be a very revealing exercise I found within different organizations. So I think that there's a wonderful opportunity in designating some, I think, and large scale organizations like the Amazons and EAs, they have the ability to be like, okay, we've identified some, hot new talent that, has high potential, and we can programs, for example. And for smaller organizations that may not have the bandwidth, I think, the dollars don't stretch quite as far, and they really are doubling down on wherever they're spending. And so making sure that where those professional development dollars are being spent, that there's a lens around considering underrepresented populations within that, because it's really important, because we have a lot of, we can talk about the recruitment, attraction, sourcing, recruitment of people into the organization, and tapping into underrepresented populations and untapped markets, and but then once the people are there, how do we make sure that we're retaining and growing that talent equally to others within the organization? And I think that's a really important thing that we consider, because when we look at the data, particularly for senior execs, and when we get into the upper, thresholds of senior management, oftentimes the diversity really falls off. So that's where I think there needs to be a bit of a lens and an allocation when it comes to the spends that we might have access to, and really looking at that and considering that as well.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that great insight. I don't think I would have ever thought of that, where those dollars, personal development dollars, are going specifically. And, you're absolutely correct. Like, as we go higher up in an organization, diversity comes down. It's a really great perspective. And honestly, thank you both of you, Rachel and Kathy, for your amazing perspectives and sharing your experience on the questions that I've had. But now we'd like to open up the space to the audience for their pertinent questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves and ask a question, or just put it in the chat if you'd like.
I've got a question here. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate your insight, and Kathy, yours as well. You've got similar but unique perspectives based on your experience. One of the challenges that I've encountered in large organizations is there can be quite a bit of words. So, externally on the website, internally, and, updates and all of that. However, the perception, and this comes true, when you're looking at the engagement surveys or the trust surveys, the perception for all those that are in underrepresented groups is nowhere near making the mark. And in this one organization I'm thinking of in particular, yes, all leaders needed to take the training, and it was a 2-hour training, and you were assessed if you didn't complete it. So, but it kind of left this feeling that it was sort of a check the box type of exercise. So I'm just wondering if either of you have encountered that, where the words and the slide decks and the beginning of meetings, it's all talked about, but it's the perception. So maybe there are some actions being done, but the overall perception is that no, not even close.
I can share my experience. People have to be held accountable. There has to be an action that has to be taken. Performative training, compliance, tick in the box. Honestly, I've had so many conversations over the years with leaders, internal and external, that are like, well, if we just get some bias training, that'll solve all of our problems. I'm like, oh, it's a start, and it's a very small start. So I believe that you have to have some type of outcome and action for leaders, so that it doesn't become a performative experience. Yes, I took a 3-day workshop, and I've talked about racism and cissexism and gender, and but what are you going to do with that? How is that going to show up for you as a leader? What's that going to do to your bench? What's that going to do to your hiring and recruiting and your development plans and your coaching, the coaching opportunities and the sponsorship opportunities for those in your groups that have been systemically marginalized? So it's one thing to attend, it's another thing to actually have action. And that's where I think we in the DEI space, in the HR space, in the employee experience space, we can help our leaders, we can coach them to build the goals. And if a company has a DEI strategy, then I believe it's incumbent on all those leaders, whether they're C-suite or the next layer down, to have actual goals written out that are going to help them achieve not just the strategy goals, but their own organizational based goals that they want to go forward on.
I thought that was extremely well said, Rachel. And I don't have a lot to add there, but ultimately, I feel as though, there's a lot of ticky boxes happening, right? There is a lot of like, I'm gonna tick this box, and I think the real change that I've seen, where a couple of things. One is around sort of understanding in the moment what a microaggression actually looks like when someone is actually saying something that is being perceived by an underrepresented individual, that and or having an experience, and being able to in a gently and diplomatic way get through that and actually call it out, it can be really transformative and actually sort of push people into the education zone where they're like, okay, what now? What do I need to read? I had no idea I was doing this. I've been speaking like this my whole life. What I didn't even know, and I didn't mean anything by it. But what do you mean it was perceived this way, right? And so I think that calling people out in a very in the right way, in a safe way of like, we make mistakes, but you're making a mistake, and that's, you need to take a moment and you need to recalibrate and go check yourself and go apologize for what just went down, because that's not okay. The way that meeting, that transaction happened, like whatever that looked like, those moments can be really pivotal for leaders and for managers and staff in general, and for the individuals themselves, because then they feel seen and heard. So I've seen when we can have individuals in the room that are trained and understand and have that empathy and that are attuned to that and can help guide and question and qualify things as you're moving through the dialogue and the conversations, that's when a lot of the work can happen. And then following it up with coaching and the more intensive conversations and there's so many wonderful resources and books and opportunities for an individual to learn and embrace that learning. And then I've also just seen like organizations like I find Microsoft to be a fascinating example where it's like senior leadership is bonused out based on representation. Full stop. Like, we're going to compensate. We're starting at the top down. Make sure your team is comprised. Like, you want a high functioning, amazing team. Hire also for representation. That doesn't. They're not exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. Determinants here. Like we can do these two things and make an effort, and we're going to compensate that. And your bonuses, people have more significant bonuses. So I think there's that. It has made some fairly transformative impact, I would say, as well. And I think around the culture in general, from what I've seen year over year as well, just like outsider looking in. But yeah.
Thank you both for that. RBC does tie their bonus into it as well, and they are top down, I think one of the best when it comes to D&I. And sadly, I think more organizations, if it helps to move the needle, I would challenge, I guess, why more organizations don't take that step as well to move from the words to the action.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for the question. And thank you, Kathy and Rachel, for answering. We do have a question in the chat. So should the parameters to evaluate talent be same across all the DEI categories, or should we consider different approaches for different DEI categories?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. And Rachel, I don't know if this is your sense too, but I want to understand, is it that, in a job, there's a set of evaluation criteria and that we're asking whether or not individuals should be considered, like, rated differently depending on their representation? Is that the question? I just want to make sure.
Yes, because a lot of the groups which we are trying to include in our healthcare system right now may not have the same opportunity as their other counterparts. So should we be mindful of the non-accessibility that they have had? For example, like tenure is something that not everybody has in healthcare in a unionized environment, but we do want to implement DEI initiatives. How do we traverse through that dilemma? Is there anything that you can recommend or suggest in such a scenario?
Rita, can I just jump in for a moment? I have an idea on this I want to share.
Of course.
Hello, and thank you for that question. So I was thinking about this from the context of the business side. So we want to, I'll stop walking. I just realized I'm walking around. And I was thinking about, what I hear from some teams, and I bet you, Rachel, heard this a lot at EA, is when we were trying to hire diverse talent, what are we sacrificing? Like, I want to hire the best for my team. I want to have the best talent for my team. And sort of that's the challenge that we truly face, both on a team level and a corporate and business level, right? There is a business bottom line that's needed. Yes. And at the same time, we care about diversity. So here's my answer. It's culturally intelligent hiring practices that are inclusive. And what that means is, for example, at EA, we used to be very good at defining consistent questions and a framework for interviewing candidates. Where I think we sometimes fell down, and perhaps now these days it's gone a lot further than when I left a number of years ago, was sometimes we didn't create a consistent framework for what a good answer looked like. So we could allow bias to creep into the evaluation process by not already saying, hey, this education or this experience or this element of what we want to hear from the candidate in terms of their stories is critical and or important and relevant to the skills and the experience we need to bring to this role. And so by defining a good answer up front, you're less likely to have bias and more likely to be more inclusive in how you interview. And I don't know that that fully answers your question, but it's one of the ways that I see that we can address both sides of the equation a little bit.
Thanks, Tina. I think that's really helpful guidance. And I just wanted to ask a qualifying question. Are we talking about a regulated or a non-regulated sector? Or
both actually. Both I think faces the same problem because I work for workforce strategies and implementation team, which encounters both realized and excluded employees. So I would really like to know, and thank you, Tina, for answering that question. If Rachel or Kathy, if you can throw some light on this a bit further.
I apologize. I think you cut out a tiny bit, so I didn't catch all of it, but I'm wondering whether or not it's a competency question as well, like is what's coming from us around.
Okay, let me rephrase the question. Is there like a fine balance between competency and maintaining DEI within the organization? Like what Tina said also resonates with what I've been facing for quite some time now. Because I do have a competent talent, but it is not what the manager wants. It's if they want to represent somebody in DI, but I'm not finding talent there. How do I balance between the two and rationalize that?
And what sector do you work in? Sorry.
Mostly tech and healthcare.
Yeah. Okay. And I suspected. Okay. So I work the Care Providers Association, and I do a lot of immigration strategy and other things as well. So I think I might understand some of your challenges. And what I would say is if you take a competency-based approach, you might be able to eliminate some of the difficulties around this. But I feel like there might be some other details that I'm not capturing and catching, and I apologize for that. So, but and Rachel, maybe you can jump in, but I suspect that there might be an approach here around tapping into exactly what the competencies are for the roles that you're attempting to hire for. Is that possibly correct? If it's a regulated sector?
Yes.
Yeah. So and I understand that there's massive labor shortages across the board. So you're facing a really difficult set of constraints right now in that there's limited talent available, and you're attempting to fill massive, I think there's 22,000 open positions for care aides, just as an example in BC. Not that we're going to frightening. I'm working on the policy stuff. So, but like so there's like massive labor market constraints that you're facing, and then you're looking overseas for talent, doing LMIAs to bring them in, and then having to try to incorporate to bring people with Canadian standardized certifications into the fold and get them up and running as quickly as possible. Am I correct?
Yes, 100%. I think you nailed it. You nailed it.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk later. You can, well, yeah, but maybe there's someone else might have some other insights. But I feel like it's a very specific situation that's very challenging. I sympathize genuinely.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I see that Sherry has also something to share. Thank you so much, Sherry. Oh, we can't hear you, Sherry.
How's that? Is that better? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think Kathy nailed it, but I heard tech and I heard healthcare. So I had to put up my hand because I've worked 30 plus years in technology and almost 20 years in healthcare. So a couple of tidbits that I want to contribute is that, of course, you always have this question of, if I'm hiring for diversity, is that coming at the expense of expertise? And ideally it never would, but practically it might, because as a marginalized community, maybe you've never had the opportunity to learn and therefore you're at a disadvantage all the time. So one of the strategies that I can suggest is that you, as a hiring manager, assuming that's the position you're in, you strategize an entry-level position. So if I were hiring a BA, I might have a junior BA or a junior quality assurance or a junior dev. And I take it on myself to advocate for somebody who may not have the experience, but if I feel they're hitting all those core values and they've got a keen attitude and I feel they can learn, and I want to be the person that gives them that hand up, I partner with them. But on the other side, I'm very, very clear that if this person meets certain markers, they're going to be paid equitably and fast. So we have like a 6-month marker that says if they meet all these markers that everyone else is being paid at, we're going to pay them the same. And I'm going to mentor and I'm going to coach and I'm going to support that person. And if you go through those cycles a few times, you probably no longer have to bring them in at a bottom rate. You can prove it. The other thing is, if you're using contractors, which we do a lot in tech, just tell your staffing vendors, I'm looking for diversity. It's amazing how many times they'll shortlist the white male for you because they think if I'm only going to give you 3 resumes, it's going to be the person who's most palatable. So if you say to them, I'm looking for diversity in this team and I want this person to be able to meet all my must-haves and some of my nice-to-haves, but there's not diversity in my team. So right now I need to think about hiring someone that is older or younger or LGBTQ or has a physical or an invisible disability. Just know that I'm open to that and throw that out there. And it's amazing. Once I did that, all of a sudden I had a plethora of really, really, really top-notch candidates that I just wasn't seeing before, which is still baffling to me that I had to specifically ask for them.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for answering that, and Kathy and Rachel and Tina, all of you for joining in and answering this pertinent question. And it comes up a lot, right? What do we champion? And when we're championing one thing over the other, who are we leaving out? So thank you for addressing this question. All right, are there any other questions? We have time for one more question. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat or just feel free to unmute yourselves.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing to the previous comments. And that is, the other thing to do as well is to consider what assumptions you're making that actually are irrelevant to the job, but are taking out perfectly good candidates. And an example that I've seen in the workplace is in job descriptions, requiring everyone to have a class 5 driver's license. There's a heck of a lot of jobs that require supposedly a class 5 driver's license, and the resumes get tossed before they get that far because the person doesn't have a driver's license. You have to stop and say, are we actually going to ask this person to ever drive a vehicle? If the answer is no, get rid of the requirement, because what you're excluding is you're excluding people who, for example, live in the city and have never needed to learn to drive. I've got a stepsister who lives in an area with really good transit. She's never needed to learn to drive, and there's lots of jobs where that's not needed, but it's something that is there's an implicit bias toward hiring people that look like the people that are currently there, and oh look, they've all got driver's licenses because they're a certain age, they grew up in a certain environment, and so on and so forth. And I think that's one of the things that people really overlook.
I just wanted to voice I would 100% concur, and I think we're seeing a big shift, I think, in technology right now as well, in that the go-to, you must have a engineering degree, comp science degree, whatever that looks like. It's like, well, you look at the population of individuals who have the capacity to go to a 4-year degree program and are, hitting the 94 or 96% that you need to get into UBC engineering, because there aren't enough seats, different issue. But I think there's a lot, there's serious barriers that we're throwing up, maybe unnecessarily, right? And it's not to say that education is not important and that every job doesn't necessarily, like there may be some requirements there, but I will say that, they're considering, and especially right now, we're moving into a whole era around micro-credentialing and like, okay, well, what are people transitioning from other sectors of the economy? And across the board, the labor market is tight. It is tight, and it's going to be tight for a long time to come, and it's going to get a lot worse. And so you look at that and well, we're probably, we need to, maximize, of course, domestic workforce and be hiring for diversity and tapping into all the untapped markets in terms of the underrepresented populations that we could be attracting into our respective organizations that we may not be because we're not thinking that way, or we've been a bit blocked in the past, or whatever those caveats might be. I think like it's a wonderful time to be in the space and know that there's so much being done around just matchmaking around different populations at this time. And then it'll be fascinating to see what happens, because the employers that aren't doing this though will be left behind. Is ultimately, it's like this is the new reality. This is what has to happen. And work from home and COVID has only made us that much more attuned to being able to make lots of adjustments on our very core requirements around including being able to go into an office. So it's a whole new world.
You're muted, Amrita.
Amrita.
Okay, so I'm so sorry. Okay. Yeah, technology, everything that can go wrong always does. So yeah, I just wanted to thank Anne for answering the question, and for Kathy as well. And I love how the community here has come together to answer this question, and that is exactly what Lean In is about. Supporting each other and answering the questions that are pertinent to the community. We do not have time for more questions, but I really, really appreciate you all joining us today, giving us your time and energy. And thank you especially to the panelists, Rachel and Kathy, for stepping in, for sharing their experiences and talking about what they've learned throughout this year. So I'm really thankful that they could give their time and energy to us to Lean In. And thank you everybody else for joining in. Stay tuned for more of our events that are coming up soon. We do have a short networking opportunity after this. So if you'd like to stay and talk to each other, we would love that. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you, Amrita, for the both sessions and keeping us on track and bringing us together. So thank you for all your work and efforts.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Tina and everyone. It's wonderful. Great dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Kathy.